Imagine, you're Kazuki Takahashi, the creator of the world-famous Yu-Gi-Oh franchise. Honestly, you never expected this series to take off in such a massive way, especially off the back of a Magic the Gathering homage that was originally intended to be a one-off thing in your episodic horror manga, focused on funny little games like setting bullies on fire. But fans loved the idea of the card game so much that you gradually expanded on it until it became the global phenomenon that it is now. To the point world tournaments were being held yearly, and fans were crashing into the Konami offices with the release of every new ban list. Now it's 2006 though, and production is wrapping up on the anime sequel series Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. After a decade, you feel this is the time to end the series and move on to something else. But the production staff on the anime ring you up like,
"Come on, man, just one more series, and then we'll never, ever, ever ask another one from you ever again."
Alright, fine, one more. But if you're gonna do this, you're gonna go big. Yu-Gi-Oh! Meets Akira. That means motorcycles. That means an oppressive shadow government. That means a futuristic dystopian setting layered with social class commentary. And psychic powers.
Are we doing the Akira slide?
Are we doing the Akira slide? Of course we're gonna do the Akira slide. You think we're gonna do a futuristic setting with motorcycles and not do the Akira bike slide somewhere? Get your head out of your ass. And that, in essence, is how we got Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's. But why do I bring all this up? Well, ever since I was a tiny child, Yu-Gi-Oh's always been my kind of comfort trash. Yeah, it's a series where any ideological debate is settled with a game of canasta in order to advertise the newest booster packs, but once you accept its bizarre internal logic of Egyptian gods and blue eyes white jets, it's unbelievably easy to sink into, both in its surprisingly endearing characters and engaging card systems. There's a reason that few card-focused series took off in the same way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Did. Anyone remember Chaotic? Or Duel Masters? So while I've been distracting myself from finishing part 2 of the reboot video, which is totally coming and definitely not cancelled by higher up management, I've been relying on my go-to form of procrastination, playing Duel Links on my phone, which inevitably led me to going back to rewatching past Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. Duel Monsters, GX, 5D's, and started on Ark V since I never watched it all the way through when it was recently added into Duel Links. Now, originally when I was watching through these series and planning out a potential video, I intended to talk about GX and how it's a near perfect sequel to the original series. But then I got to 5D's, and that's when I noticed something. In talking to friends and acquaintances who were into Yu-Gi-Oh! Back in the day like I was, it seems that most got to this series when Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's, more like Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's nuts! Ha! Got 'em! And then moved on to Gears of War 2. Makes sense since people my age got into the original series when they were in their preteens and it was popular in the schoolyard. So 5D's was airing when they were firmly in high school territory and transitioning out of Saturday morning cartoons. But that's disappointing because 5D's is by far one of the most interesting things Yu-Gi-Oh! Has ever had to offer. What makes 5D's stand out is how it immediately differentiated itself from everything that came before or after. The protagonists were aged up, the tone was grimmer without being aggressively edgy, there's nuanced themes related to poverty and privilege, within the context of still being a card game series. When I implied this was Akira meets Yu-Gi-Oh!, I wasn't kidding. You can tell that 5D's is where the creators tried to break out of the mold that the previous series had found themselves in. And for the most part, they nailed it. So while I will eventually cover the previous series, because I love some of these dumbasses too much not to talk about them at some point, for now, I have a major itch to dig into 5D's, and my ADD brain only lets me focus on one hyper-obsession at a time. That means for today, we're going to be talking about why this anime about card games being played on motorcycles is actually pretty sick, and in a lot of ways, Yu-Gi-Oh! At its peak.
この番組はグランドスポーツの提供でお送りします。
So first things first, let's get the main premise I'm sure is on everyone's mind out of the way. That being
Card games on motorcycles.
Card games on motorcycles!
Card games on motorcycles.
Crow, did you hear that? Card games on motorcycles!
yes, if there's one thing 5D's is prolific for, even for those who haven't watched it, it's the fact that a majority of the duels happen on motorbikes. I remember when the series started airing in the West, it was already getting memed into the dirt for its initial sales pitch. And admittedly, it is patently ridiculous and over the top. But same goes for most of Yu-Gi-Oh's core premise. The original series is an ancient Egyptian pharaoh possessing the body of a high school boy and going on adventures where nearly every conflict is resolved through a round of Cards Against Humanity, which originated a couple millennia ago, but motorcycles is what crossed the line. Granted, a lot of things in the previous series could be hand-waved away with a simple, it's magic, and get away with it, where playing cards on a moving vehicle was rooted just enough in reality that it started putting viewers' suspension of disbelief in a vice grip. If you can get over that though, you'd find that duel runners are easily the best addition 5D's brought to the series. After nearing a decade of card games, the duels in the original series and GX were slowly growing stale. Still fun, but there's only so many ways you can frame two characters standing in a field throwing cards at each other to be exciting for the viewer, without doing some gimmick to fill out an entire episode. Then in comes turbo duels, and suddenly there's entirely new dynamics to the way these scenes can be played. It's like how strip poker is a spicy advancement of regular poker. But unlike the guy who suggests playing strip poker at a party, fusion summoning on the back of a motorcycle absolutely fucks. Now it's not just about the cards being played and the holograms that can maybe sort of cause physical reactions, but how the duelists maneuver their uniquely designed duel runners. Suddenly speed, control, movement, and locales are all factors to how a duel unfolds, radically changing their pace and flow. From the very first episode of 5D's, we can see how much turbo duels change things in subtle ways, as the debut duel is a chase sequence where law enforcement are pursuing the main character, and the only way for Yusei to escape is to win, thus causing the officer's duel runner to stall out. Fast forward to their next couple duels, as Officer Trudge gradually becomes the Javert to Yusei's Jean Valjean, and his driving becomes actively aggressive and hostile in his attempts to take down this punk kid from the satellite, tossing aside any honor by attempting to run Yusei completely off the road before he can win and evade authorities yet again. Throughout 5D's, the danger of crashing being this ever-looming threat significantly increases the intensity of duels, as characters have to balance the active variable of riding with the mind games inherent with a card game, giving way to entirely different approaches of telling a story that wouldn't work with the ground-based duels of previous series. Though, to be fair, on paper, turbo duels aren't that different from the traditional format outside of the motorsports aspect. It uses unique spell cards that require speed counters, which themselves are gained each turn as the duelists speed around the track, and can be lost when players lose more than 1,000 life points, causing them to slow down. But other than a couple tangential rules that come up in the Grand Prix tournament arc, it's a modified rule set. Nothing that can't hypothetically be done sitting down, even being included in a few of the video games. So I can understand why some feel that the speed aspect doesn't feel fully utilized. In retrospect, the creators of the anime were clearly walking a fine line between trying to make turbo duels a unique style of play to keep things fresh within the 5D's universe, without adding in too many extrinsic elements or exclusive rules that turn it into anime wacky racers, possibly confusing longtime fans of the original game in the process. And in that sense, turbo duels work well. Blending the visual language of motorsports with the moment-to-moment pace of a card game is a genuinely clever solution, adding in entirely new dimensions to how duels were animated and framed. Now that characters weren't physically nailed down to whatever spot they planted their feet when they started the duel, the animators had so much more freedom when it came to set pieces and storyboarding, framing matches through the positioning of opponents in the physical race, along with the monsters being summoned. Like, I'm trying my best to rationalize this, but at the end of the day, a character casually leaping over a vat of molten iron on their duel runner as they draw the vital card they need is just rad, plain and simple. But it's not just about dueling for the sake of itself. Duels at their best in this series are more than just the cards being played. They're about the emotions and stories built around them. No one cares if Jaden beats the monkey, it's what the monkey represents. In that same way, duel runners aren't simply motorcycles equal cool, but actually are justified subtextually within the story, synchronizing with the actual themes of 5D's. However, before we start digging into that, I'm gonna have to take a quick detour and address another elephant in the room first. And that's the sub versus dub situation that hovers over any anime 4Kids localized back in the day, like some toxic miasma.
How about a nice room in a dungeon for the rest of your days?
Now, it's not a secret for anyone growing up in the early aughts that 4Kids made a habit of mishandling the anime they localized. Usually in hyper-sanitizing anything not conventionally found in Little Timmy's 3rd grade classroom, leading to hilariously bizarre abstractions.
These donuts are great! Jelly-filled are my favorite! Nothing beats a jelly-filled donut!
But the situation with Yu-Gi-Oh's dub in particular has always been an anomaly. On the one hand, between all the iconic performances and concepts like the Shadow Realm that have been fused into the fanbase's lexicon, Yugioh was the rare 4Kids dub that held up beyond the campy, so bad it's good qualities. One of the reasons Seto Kaiba has become the icon he is today was due to the phenomenal job Eric Stewart did voicing him in the dub.
And anyone who's late for registration will be disqualified. Mokuba, make sure Wheeler's late.
However, in making these changes, 4Kids also had to drastically, and I mean drastically, change the source material in order to bring it stateside, either due to localization decisions made by 4Kids themselves, or changes that were required by FCC regulations for children's programming, resulting in the tone of the series often being aged down from how it was originally written.
On your feet.
Mr. Pegasus would like to have a few words with you.
Of all the series though, there's a strong argument to be made that 5D's got the worst of this. Where GX's inherently lighthearted school setting allowed for plenty of freedom to be goofy in its localization,
I'm ready to duel! Let's go!
Yo, I'm down, but we be illin', homeboy.
I have no idea what you just said.
From moment one, 5D's is thematically and narratively built around serious subject matter related to classism, discrimination, violence, guns, and death, which had to be heavily toned down or removed altogether.
How does it look, Doctor?
He's got some serious bruising on the right side of his abdomen.
Is he going to be all right?
It's a long shot.
Since storylines like a psychic cult torturing a boy to death, resulting in his sister having a mental breakdown and driving off a cliff, leading her to make a sinister pact with an ancient evil gecko so that she can seek vengeance on her brother's killers, would be difficult to keep to a soft PG rating, 4Kids had to file down 5D's sharper edges with a belt sander, removing most of the bite when it comes to its deeper themes, even if it gave us some undeniably hilarious edits attempting to work around the darker moments of the story.
Don't worry, he's not in any pain. The child is actually creating that electrostatic force field with his telekinetic abilities.
Probably the best example of this is with the Crash Town arc, a 6-episode mini-arc that homages classic westerns, where in real time you can see 4Kids localizers twisting themselves into Honda knots to avoid showing any use of guns on screen.
No, she's right! We've been under Lawton's thumb for long enough!
Due to this requirement to censor around the use of firearms, the big finale to the last duel in Crash Town had to be removed entirely because it unavoidably concludes with a man getting shot in the head after a quick draw standoff. And that sucks, as it is the coolest moment of the entire series. I implore anyone who has not watched the sub version of this series, at the very least, look up this duel, as it is masterfully done, further highlighted by this slick western accompaniment in the background.
墓地にあるこのカードを自分のデッキの一番上に戻すことができる。
Actually, while we're on that subject, that's another thing to add to 4Kids' running tally. Like previous Yu-Gi-Oh series before, the dub for 5D's completely replaces the original soundtrack, and that ends up changing the mood of scenes on a fundamental level. 5D's grungy, futuristic atmosphere is built off the back of its mix of nu metal and techno music, to the point you can't entirely separate them without losing something. Just take a listen. For a series about card games being played on motorcycles, the OST goes surprisingly hard, in a way that the series has never quite lived up to since. Tracks like Yusei and Jack's battle themes, or the Speed World theme, so perfectly complement the racing motif that 5D's has with its duels, that it's a genuine downgrade losing it for the generic synth soundtrack that took its place. The dub makes up for it a bit with its new opening theme Hyperdrive, but the fact that Clear Mind insert song was removed from Shooting Star Dragon's first summoning is a war crime that some former 4Kids producer will answer for someday. I'll see you in hell, Michael Brady. Lastly, there's the fact that the run of 5D's English dub was cut 30 episodes short. Similar to GX a couple of years prior, 5D's entire last arc and the epilogue were never aired in English. So not only is there massive resolution issues with the main antagonists, but of the top 10 duels from this series, 6 never got localized and were completely missed by fans who never looked into the subbed version. So the one shining moment where Leo gets to be more than the annoying child side character, completely gone. The explanation for who Bruno is and why he's there, which leads to his life or death duel against Yusei, the one person he developed a mutual attachment to, never happens. For those who ever watched the original series, imagine not getting the latter half of the Battle City tournament, or the duel between Yugi and Atem. Supposedly, this quick wrap-up was due to a legal dispute between 4Kids and TV Tokyo, regarding some backdoor dealings the former was making, resulting in the Japanese broadcaster almost terminating their contracts altogether, though 4Kids claims the cuts had more to do with low TV ratings. Either way, this would explain why sizable chunks of the last season were axed, as 4Kids was racing to end it as fast as possible, and just cut anything that was seen as chaff, even if that chaff was vital plot points. Like I said, 5D's got it pretty bad. But as much as I can deride 4Kids dub for all the changes and general mistakes with how it handled 5D's, it also has that undeniable 4Kids charm to the writing and delivery of lines that's super endearing to go back to.
Try harder next time.
Is that Joey Wheeler? No, man, it's his cousin Jesse Wheeler.
Greg Abbey just fits Yusei exceptionally well, nailing that blend of stoic strategist and hopeful optimist, even if 4Kids edits butchered the character's best moments. And they made Jack Atlas a Cockney Brit. How can you not love that?
Delivery! I don't think so. I ordered the Kung Pao chicken with a side of soup.
You nincompoop! That's our store delivery, not your lunch. Beat it!
That's why, despite everything I say going forward being in reference to the original Japanese version, I'm going to primarily rely on the English names and terms, since that's what I was raised on. And let's be real, D-Wheel just doesn't have the same ring that Dual Runner has. Which nicely brings me back around from that earlier detour into 5D's own world building. As I already mentioned, an extremely ever-present theme early on in 5D's is classism and discrimination, as it is riddled throughout its world building. The main setting for the series is split across two areas. First, you have New Domino City, a functional utopia where the well-off citizens go to stadiums to watch duels transformed into the Talladega, and turbo duelists perform for their ravenous fans.
Show us a butthole or something! What are we doing? Butthole! Butthole!
Absolutely cutthroat. And then there's the Satellite, a slum island off the coast of the city, rife with urban decay, where the poor and criminals are left to waste away with zero established ways to move up to New Domino, with the only thing connecting the two being a pipeline for the city to send over its garbage. Whether you're born there or a criminal that was kicked out of the city and left to rot, you are Satellite scum for the rest of your life, only meant to recycle and process trash being fed in from New Domino. Technically, the satellite has only existed for approximately 17 years by the start of the series, when a new NRD reactor, the D stands for dueling, went critical, causing the area to break off from New Domino. But that hasn't stopped those from the satellite being treated with the same public disdain as someone announcing their new investment in NFTs. Immediately, the series establishes this contrast in its setting with the dichotomy of our two main protagonists, Yusei Fudo and Jack Atlas. While Jack is living high in New Domino City as the reigning king of turbo duels, cheered on by adoring fans and signing movie deals, Yusei is left in the satellite, salvaging enough scraps to put together a working duel runner that can get him out of there before he's caught by sector security. And it's this contrast that's the initial driving force of the story. Years ago, Jack stole Yusei's Stardust Dragon and first duel runner back when they were friends so that he could get into New Domino, and now Yusei has to work his way up to the city to even things out. But that's more complicated than it initially sounds. And here's where we get into the deeper stuff with 5D's. You see, in a world where card games are the center of everything, even being included in the school curriculum, those in the satellite are completely limited from any opportunities a good deck could provide for them by the very nature that cards aren't easily accessible there. Without things like card shops around or the finances to purchase them, those stuck on the island are left to scrounge for what few cards they can find in this near lawless wasteland, like Yu-Gi-Oh players doing trades at locals. This can be as simple as sorting through New Domino's trash for cards someone tossed out, to outright mugging others for theirs, making a usable deck an extremely precious resource. While it seems like these are ultimately minor details in a story where all the characters have perfectly put together decks, it actually goes far to explain the sheer emotional attachment those from the satellite have with their cards. Yusei's belief that there are no useless cards doesn't come from the same idealistic sentimentality that previous protagonists have, but from someone who spent years building their deck from cards others thought weren't worth keeping. Hence the extra meaning behind his archetype of choice actually being junk. Monsters that are designed as weak on their own until they're pieced together effectively. His deck might be made up of cards others tossed out that he was able to scrape together, but it's incredibly sentimental to him, which is understandable in a place like the satellite, where the way many orphans are left to learn their reading and arithmetic is from the cards they've found in the trash, ignoring the implication that any Yu-Gi-Oh player actually reads their cards. But even if someone can scrounge up a decent deck, duel runners are something else entirely. Turbo duels may have become a pastime for the citizens of New Domino, but runners are effectively non-existent in the satellite. At best, only glimpsed through televised matches from the stadium on the few working TVs left lying around. Yusei is one of the few shown to own a runner because he was able to put it together himself with scraps lying around the satellite and the personal know-how he developed over years of trial and error working with auto mechanics. Hence why Jack stealing the first one they built together was such a betrayal. It's not exactly like he can call up his insurance about it. If not to underline the irony of all of this, duel runners are the only way shown that people are able to leave the satellite and escape to New Domino, meaning they both diametrically represent privilege and freedom. Oh, but just in case the veiled messaging of all this was too subtle, on top of it all, everything from decks to duel runners in satellite are actively suppressed by sector security. Wouldn't want the riffraff getting any ideas. Sector security do their patrols through the island less to protect and serve, but to make sure those in satellite stay in satellite, resulting in the citizens forming their own duel gangs as a form of self-protection. And that eventually escalates to... Like I've been saying, it's a rough area. And for those caught breaking the law in Satellite or New Domino, like stealing back cards from Sector Security or playing an Eldritch deck, they're taken to the facility, where they're painfully branded with face tattoos that both act as a tracking chip and a permanent marker of someone's criminal past, even after they've served their time in prison. So those facial markings aren't simply a way to give a bit of visual flair to the character's design. It's an in-world tagging system for prisoners that publicly marks them as a criminal for life. And I hope I don't have to explain why that's a tad fucked up. Through its multiple systems, from a lack of a proper education system to hostile law enforcement, those of Satellite are made to be systematically trapped there with no way out. In fact, the sole reason Yusei is allowed into New Domino to participate in the huge Fortune Cup being held is that Rex Goodwin, the director of the city, suspects that he's a signer, one of the 5 predestined heroes intended to save the world. If it wasn't for that, Yusei would still be getting electroshock treatment in the facility after initially getting caught by Sector Security escaping into New Domino to settle his score with Jack. Thank the Crimson Dragon for main character privileges. What makes this all even more insidious is when it's revealed that this segregated hierarchy is largely manufactured by Goodwin himself, who admits that the Zero Reverse event that originally separated Satellite from the mainland also freed the Earthbound Immortals, ancient evil deities heralding the King of the Netherworld, thus making Satellite the future battleground for their 5,000-year war against the Crimson Dragon's signers. If the people of the satellite were allowed to migrate over, that would simply move the battleground to New Domino, as the Earthbound Immortals require a massive amount of souls to manifest. So Goodwin's solution was just to isolate everything to that one area through systematic discrimination and dehumanization. A very, let's say, utilitarian approach intended to limit casualties by effectively making the citizens of Satellite resources for a proxy war they didn't agree to be part of. Because fuck the poor? And the funny thing is that this doesn't change the fact that the Earthbound Immortals still make their way into New Domino regardless, making the multiple layers of oppression ultimately redundant, because existential horrors don't discriminate. You think the writers were trying to say something about the futility of classism or something? This is what I meant when I said 5D's had so much going on beyond the motorbikes. By so firmly rooting its story in a world of haves and have-nots, and how that environment affects the character's place within it, 5D's creates a world that isn't just grim, but layered. This isn't just good by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, this is marvelous world building, period. And totally not reflective of real-world issues. That'd be crazy. I haven't even gotten into the characters proper yet because the setting is such an integral part of understanding the story being told, using these grittier yet grounded social issues as a way to frame its characters, rather than just some set dressing. But now that we've set the stage, let's get to the actors involved. Looking at the cast of 5D's, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's simply exporting characters from its previous series. You got main character with a Jersey Shore salon worth of hair gel on their head, the rival who has a lot of specific art with the MC, the chill best friend, the girl love interest, the child prodigy who never actually does much, and Leo. But I think what makes 5D's characters stand out is actually the level of maturity with how they're handled. Whether it's Crow acting as the big brother to a group of orphans in the satellite, or Yusei's deep-seated guilt that his father's NRD reactor melting down is the reason his childhood friends were orphans, there's a subtle nuance to the characters that makes them feel fleshed out beyond their archetypes. And I don't think any better reflect this than Jack Atlas and Akiza. Now, as much as I adore Seto Kaiba and his petty rich kid antics, I'd argue Jack Atlas actually edges him out as the better rival character, at least from a writing perspective. From living as an orphan growing up to spending years trying to survive the cutthroat streets of Satellite, you get a clear picture of why Jack would have this massive chip on his shoulder about wanting to prove that he's the best. Like, if I lived as a second-class citizen where I was viewed as scum by the upper class as they sent me their trash to recycle, I'd probably develop an inferiority complex and feel the need to prove myself too. With all that accounted for, it's easy to understand why, when Rex Goodwin reached out to help him get into New Domino and make him into the king he always imagined himself as, Jack jumped on the opportunity, even if it meant stealing his best friend's card and dual runner to do so. Once in the city, his ego was then consistently inflated as he was marketed as the king of turbo duels to the public, Goodwin manufacturing a backstory where he was raised in the tops of New Domino in order to guarantee that he's accepted by the fans, as there's no way he'd be accepted as a valid champion if they actually knew where he came from. And that's what makes his fall from grace that much harder when he inevitably loses to Yusei at the Fortune Cup. Having lost his title in front of the masses and his true origins as a satellite citizen made public, Jack is utterly humiliated. Largely dismissed by his former fans, he's then left to re-examine everything he gave up in pursuit of being king, as he looks across the waters to his former home that he left behind. For all his boasting about being the master of faster over the years, he couldn't back it up when it mattered, forcing him all the way back to square one. And that's why Jack is a great rival character. Not just because he's a pompous snob dead set on taking Yusei down a peg, but because he threw away everything to prove that he's the best, and learned the hard way that it wasn't worth it. And then there's Akiza. Now, Akiza's an interesting character within this franchise. She isn't an antagonistic rival that grudgingly gets swayed to the protagonist's side. She isn't a cheerleader with no actual dueling ability. Akiza is a girl with deep-seated trauma due to her psychic powers that she can't fully control. And after feeling rejected by even her own parents' fear of her abilities, she's adopted by the Arcadia movement, an organization of psychic duelists. And like any good cult, takes advantage of an emotionally vulnerable person looking for a place to belong. By the time Akiza's introduced in the story, she's fully committed to a Black Rose Witch persona as a coping mechanism for the constant rejection she's had to endure due to her abilities, which is only then reinforced when she's repeatedly booed and antagonized at the Fortune Cup, causing her to further retreat into her witch persona and the Arcadia movement. So one of the many questions the audience is left with by the end of the first tournament is, will Akiza be able to escape this cycle of rejection and reclusion that she's trapped in? I could honestly do this for every one of the main characters, but I think this gets my point across. What's great about 5D's is how surprisingly character-driven it is early on. There's depths of fear, trauma, remorse, and frustration to this cast that you might not expect at first glance that humanizes each one of them. While the story starts out centered around Yusei and Jack's personal beef, that's simply used as a jumping off point as each signer is established and the scope of the world is widened, eventually pulling them into the fight with the Dark Signers. And if you think this level of character writing is exclusive to the protagonists, well, you don't know why I'm doing this video. Now up to this point, Yugioh has had a lengthy history of villains. Maximilian Pegasus, American is Rare Hunters, Yami Bakura, Yubel, the Society of Light, the entire card-selling market, the list goes on. But what makes the Darksigners compelling villains in their own right is that for the most part, they honestly aren't really villains. They aren't made to be cartoonish baddies with evil motives purely for the sake of world domination. At least deep down. These are characters that have understandable motives who died with regrets and anger in their heart, turned by the Earthbound Immortals so that they can seek their vengeance while acting as the gods' vessels. Except for Devik. I don't know how Devik got through the screening process. To quickly run down the list, you have Geiger, whose entire village was wiped out by Goodwin's experiments, and is hung by Goodwin's brother after he fails to impale Rex at the Fortune Cup with a giant spike. Misty lost her brother to the Arcadia movement's experiments before she drove off a cliff. Carly was a reporter killed by the Arcadia movement after she found out too much, and Callan was the old leader of Yusei, Crow, and Jack's duel gang, until he took his goals of unifying Satellite too far, and... leaving him to slowly rot in the facility where he was beaten and starved. These aren't black and white motivations, but characters whose genuine griefs and struggles were manipulated into something evil by darker forces in their final moments, making their duels against the Signers that much more involving, because for most of them, there's history there. What I think is most interesting about the Dark Signers as antagonists isn't just that they're twisted innocents, but that along with their own respective issues, their matches are also used to force the Signers to face their own past mistakes. Akiza might not have killed Misty's brother like she was led to believe, but she did cause plenty of damage as the Black Rose Witch in the past. Yusei didn't rat out Cal into sector security, but is there more he could have done to save him before he took things too far? And has Jack truly changed for the better, or is it simply because he's no longer king that he's had this change of heart? By making them face off against representations of their past, the Signers are equally tempted to fall back into their worst emotions or fears, making the Dark Signers very real tests of their growth as characters. And ultimately, that's what makes a good antagonist. This entire arc, outside of the whole ancient battle for the fate of the world thing, is about how fixing things in the now requires acknowledging the mistakes of the past and reconciling with them. while also being about how larger powers are what ultimately pushes otherwise good people against each other. And is doing all this as characters are fighting against the literal manifestations of gods being summoned by the souls of innocence. How cool is that? I know Yugioh has touched on morally complex villains in the past, but the scale and emotional depth between all the characters in 5D's takes it all to a whole new level. And that's why it feels like the series wasn't planned to go past the Darksigners. By the end of episode 64, all the characters' arcs have more or less been completed, all the mysteries are effectively wrapped up, and the protagonists are left to ride off into the sunset on the new bridge that finally connects Satellite to New Domino now that the Earthbound Immortals are no longer a threat. Frankly, it feels like there's not much left to dig into from here. But we also have 90 episodes remaining. So how did they follow all this up? Now, if you pay attention to discussions surrounding the show online, you might get the impression that everything past the Darksigner arc is hot garbage on a summer day in Satellite, depending on who you talk to. But it's not quite that drop that you see in some other series. In fact, many of the best duels and moments are in 5D's latter half. It's more that the series never quite reaches that consistent high that it did with the Fortune Cup Darksigner storyline, which is just as frustrating in a way because it easily could have, if not surpassed it. Put in weeb terms, this is 5D's Boo Saga, where it had so much potential going in that it never fully realized, so most conversations around it eventually delve into the mistakes that were made and how it could have been improved. Which is exactly what we're going to be doing. To start, the very opening of 5D's next arc instantly fumbles the ball when Yusei explains how in the 6 months following the fight against the Darksigners and the new Daedalus Bridge being constructed, all tensions between the citizens of Satellite and New Domino City has been completely resolved and everyone is finally at peace. Because if modern history has taught us anything, it's that tensions between two groups separated by years of classism, discrimination, and systematic segregation can totally be mended in a half year. Build bridges, not walls. To be clear, I'm not against the idea of things being actively improved. With the amount of depressing dystopias that wallow in suffering, it's honestly great to see 5D's setting shift to how people can come together to find common ground once those divisions are dissolved and the ruling class are violently removed from power, working as a follow-up to the previous arc's underlying narrative about making amends for past mistakes. There didn't need to be a 12-point plan for urban revitalization established to fix these deeply systemic issues from the card game motorcycle anime. But considering all the stories that could have been told within this setting shift, just for everything to happen off-screen in the time it takes me to complete a video is far less compelling than actually seeing the moment-to-moment beats and hurdles of the world changing. For example, it makes sense that the main characters are given special treatment as famous duelists that save the city, but then the next step would be showing how average citizens from Satellite reintegrate into this population that once viewed them as human garbage, now that they can move freely within New Domino. Officer Trudge has a whole mini character arc in the previous season dedicated to him realizing the mistakes he made, criminalizing those that lived in the Satellite, when they were simply trying to survive with the bad hand they were dealt. But what about the rest of Sector Security that were effectively trained to oppress the citizens there? Did they just get a training video to go over? There's just so much more that could have been explored here, but it really feels like one of the most engaging aspects of 5D's world building was tossed aside for seemingly no reason other than it was getting too heavy. It's not as if it was resolved in a huge, meaningful way that leaves some questions to be filled through Tumblr headcanons. The writers just went, I'm done playing with this toy. And it's not like they were in a rush and didn't have time to delve into these subjects either. A major point of contention with the preceding arcs is that it starts off with a stretch of inane fluff episodes as the new main thread is established. But rather than using that time to effectively examine the new relationship between Satellite and New Domino City, which feels like such a freebie from a writer's perspective considering the main cast have now moved into the city and are living out of a garage, instead, we get episodes about Leo investigating a haunted house in the forest, and Crow helping their landlady connect with her estranged son. Don't get me wrong, some of these episodes are still enjoyable. Callan's search for a meaningful death in Crash Town after recovering from his time as a Dark Signer being an extremely notable highlight. But as a whole, these characters aren't being used to their best effect here. What makes this especially frustrating is that the struggle of getting to this unified utopia would have worked beautifully with the central theme of 5D's second half, which focuses on fighting for one's future, in a very literal sense. Rather than starting on everything being fixed now and protecting it, having a dynamic where the signers have to both prove a better future as possible while actively demonstrating in the present would have blended together so perfectly that it's a little infuriating that isn't the angle the writers took. Now, as fandoms are wont to do, there's a slew of rumors floating around online to explain the sudden shift between 5D's two halves that are likely riddled throughout the comments already. Many of which that have the founding of a random 4chan post and don't hold up to a moment of actual research. Like how Crow was supposedly planned to be the secret final boss of the Dark Signers, but ended up taking Leo's place as a signer instead because his Blackwing deck became popular in the real-life meta. Despite the fact it doesn't line up with the production timeline, and the popularity of a character's deck has never once influenced their prominence in the series. In actuality, the likely explanation is a lot simpler. Along with Kazuki Takahashi becoming even less involved with the creative side after the Dark Signer arc, the lead writer for the series, Atsuhiro Tomioka, left shortly after the Fortune Cup arc, leaving Shin Yoshida to take over what they'd set up, as well as creating a new storyline for what comes after the Dark Signers. It's nothing more insidious than two writers having opposing ideas they'd rather emphasize within a single series, resulting in contradicting approaches to some of the characters, along with a shift to a more plot-driven story. Konami wasn't attempting a psyop to trick you into buying more Blackwing cards, it's just a writer who felt Crow worked better as a signer than Leo. But let's put a pin in that for now. Also, with the change in lead writers, it's worth noting that 5D's was being made at the same time as the 10th anniversary film. The reason why this is notable is that Studio Gallop, the studio that produced every Yu-Gi-Oh series up until 7's, isn't particularly large. So it's easy to imagine having to juggle both a long-running series and a feature film could lead to the staff being jumbled around trying to manage both at the same time without clear ideas to follow through with, resulting in storylines getting set up with no planned payoff and less fleshed out direction in the character writing, at least compared to the previous 60 episodes. But this isn't Yu-Gi-Oh theory, so let's get back to what's actually here. You put a Yu-Gi-Oh writer's back into a corner, and their immediate response is to start drafting a tournament arc to get out. So with the Dark Signer issue resolved and no lingering plot threads remaining, the immediate segue into the next storyline is the World Grand Prix tournament. 5D's is basically a tournament arc sandwich, where it starts with one and ends with one, with a short finale as a topper depending on what region you're in. At its core, the World Grand Prix is a simple framing device to prop up the larger plot of time-traveling cyborgs sent to fix the past that will be acting as the main threat for the next 80 episodes, which isn't bad on paper. Nearly every Yu-Gi-Oh series has some form of tournament mixed with world-ending schemes or cults, because the format blends well with how do we find an excuse for the protagonists and villains to play a children's card game for the fate of the world. Hell, this is 5D's second one. Tournaments are just a perfect setup to highlight different characters' personalities and playstyles with how they're matched up together, something that's pretty vital for a series built around cards. But even within the larger Yu-Gi-Oh universe, the World Grand Prix stands on its own. Compared to the previous Turbo Duel format established, the Grand Prix uses teams of 3, with matches set up using a survival format where teams alternate through members as their life points get depleted, leaving whatever cards are on the field when they lose for the next person to follow. The new Speed World 2 field spell also replaces the original, adding in the ability to use speed counters for different effects depending on how many are used. Though this comes at the cost of the rule where taking over 1,000 points of damage loses the player's speed and counters, thus shifting the focus from maintaining speed in favor of managing resources between teammates. Honestly, I really like this format. It has a distinct pacing from even tag duels, emphasizing planning out the long game since cards and counters on the field carry over between duelists, making matches just as much about team-based strategies as the individual duels. It's not just the 3 starring players either. Since the tournament is designed around teams acting as their own pit crew, there's the extra detail where they can relay brief messages to the current person in the match as they pass by, allowing communication between team members in a limited capacity for strategizing. It's a format that attempts to make use of all players involved. Keyword being attempts, but we'll get to that. Plus, the WGP tournament provides 2 of the most standout duels from this series. Team 5D's match with Team Teo, followed by their match with Team Ragnarok. Now, if Pro, Jack, and Yusei are the scrappy underdogs that rose up the ranks from the slums, Team Teo are what they'd be if they didn't have their magic signer powers. 3 poor farmers from the sticks who've scrapped together enough trash Duelist Kingdom era normal monsters to build a deck in hopes of joining the tournament. They have to share a single, barely functioning duel runner between them, and are initially booed by the audience for their constant stall tactics being boring to watch, until their long-term strategy is revealed and the crowd immediately changes their tune. You couldn't make them more of an underdog without giving them a sick puppy as a mascot. But that's what makes Team Teo so endearing to watch as they fight their hardest against teams with far superior decks and runners, solely for the purpose of seeing how far a few country bumpkins can go if they tried. They're just some good boys doing their best, even if 4Kids didn't feel they were worth including. Then on the complete opposite side of the narrative parallels is Team Ragnarok, who are clearly meant to contrast where the signers are now, coming into the tournament ready to use their own Norse god-given powers to save the day from the looming threat facing the city. With Team Teo reflecting 5D's humble origins, Ragnarok swings in the opposite direction by having characters with similar bullshit magic backing them, so the characters have to prove they're the better heroes for the job if they want to keep their protagonist privileges. And it's got the insane spectacle of having to fight the literal Norse gods of mythology to do it. Between these 2 teams, there's a poetic reflection of how far Team 5Ds have come throughout the series. It's almost like there's this motif going on related to surpassing one's own limits or something. However, this arc has one fatal flaw that gives it the stability of a Blue Eyes player going up against a deck that requires actual strategy to use. And ironically, it's the World Grand Prix format itself. You see, as much as I can praise the concept for its clever ideas and hype moments, the new format is a bit of a double-edged sword, where it's hurting nearly as much as helping. With the tournament being built around 3v3 matches, each round of the bracket ends up lasting for a minimum of 4 episodes, which is a fine length for your big cinematic showdowns, but not for competing against random jobbers in the preliminaries that never show up again. Team 5D's only duels 5 other teams throughout the tournament, but added up, that's approximately dedicated episodes, leaving 0 time for any other teams to have their own matches, making you wonder why they went with the tournament format to begin with if that's how it would be paced out. In other series, some of the best duels are minor characters facing off against each other, completely removed from the main protagonist, thus adding to the suspense and anticipation on who will face who as you go down the brackets. The Battle City finals are a perfect example of this. Same goes for the Fortune Cup. But when it comes to the World Grand Prix, since we only have time to show the duels involving Team 5Ds with how long they are, it becomes obvious that they're the ones heading to the finals, especially once Team New World manipulates time so they'll be the final matchup. Which is a short-sighted approach to writing something like a tournament arc. I mean, look at Sherry and her butler Ellsworth. Prominent characters introduced in this arc, using the tournament to get close to the ones organizing it as a way to solve the death of Sherry's parents, yet we never see any of her matches. Maybe the writers knew since her plans didn't require her to win the tournament, it wasn't necessary to show her progressing through, but considering her mini-boss promotion later on, it's a glaring missed opportunity not to give her at least a single episode match as a way to develop her more. Nope, into the void of time with you, thought. Not only does this format mean other teams don't get as much screen time though, it even carries over to the main cast themselves. With the 3-man teams, every character that isn't Yusei, Crow, or Jack are sidelined for the remainder of the season. Even then, with Yusei set as the anchor of the team, matches naturally always have to come down to him to make sure there's a proper give and take flow with their opponents. But that ends up creating a sort of Goku effect, where every problem inevitably has to be solved by Yusei. The worst of this being their match against Team Unicorn, where he has to take on the entire team by himself after Jack and Akiza are both eliminated. Speaking of, if there was anyone who got it rough this season, it's Akiza. One of the highlights of the previous arcs, Akiza had some decent potential going into this tournament, even testing for a learner's permit after getting a taste for it riding with Yusei. From the setup, you expect this to be used as a way to expand on Akiza's character by having her strive to keep up with the rest of the team while learning the thrills of turbo duels. But after getting a single episode of development taking over for an injured Crow in the first match, she's then tossed back to warming the bench for the rest of the tournament. Good hustle, Akiza. See you again in 40 episodes.
I know that you all took a big chance letting me on the team. And I know how much you guys all want to win this Grand Prix. I wasn't ready.
You're right, you weren't ready.
Outside of the general mishandling of some of its characters, pretty much every issue in this chunk of the series comes down to a real lack of direction and proper pacing in how to handle this story arc, since it's trying to juggle both a tournament with a completely new structure and the main antagonist's time shenanigans. And that leads me to the second recurring issue 5D's runs into with these later arcs: time travel. Look, I know everyone loves Terminator, but if I can give one word of advice for any aspiring writers out there, it is to avoid time travel plots like it's a Blanca player. That is, only engaging with it when absolutely necessary. While it's indeed provided some of the greatest stories ever told, time travel is possibly one of the toughest concepts a writer can introduce into their world. Because if it's not extremely well thought out, you immediately open yourself up to scrutiny from the audience. If these characters can travel through time, why didn't they just do XYZ? If they went back to the past to change something, wouldn't that create a time paradox where the event of them being sent back never happens? Why didn't they just go back to kill Hitler? And 5D's is a prime example. To make this easier for me, because frankly my brain's already making TARDIS noises, I'm going to start with the main antagonist story first, and then dissect it from there. So approximately 200 years into the future, synchro summons proved to be the first step to a perpetually evolving system that loses all control, gradually leading to a dark, hostile future dystopia that no one could survive in, leaving only the worst to fight over the scraps, where the survivors are indistinguishable from beasts, as they lose whatever's left of their humanity for one more chance to make it through another day. Sorry, I've been playing a lot of Master Duel lately. To be more specific, the evolution of synchro summoning over the last 2 centuries, combined with humanity's utter hubris, caused the world's energy reactors to go critical, summoning an army of killer robots bent on humanity's destruction. In an attempt to save the remainder of the world's population from the invasion after its initial attack, a scientist tries to rally the masses using Yusei's stolen valor as a great hero of the past. But it ultimately fails, leaving 4 humans on the planet: Zone, Asporio, Antinomy, and, in a clever tie-in to the 10th anniversary film, Paradox. The 4 then spend the remainder of their years working on a solution for saving the past from this apocalyptic future. And what did they come to after all these years? To turn themselves into robots, go back to the past, form a secret society, organize a citywide tournament to generate enough dueling energy to summon a repurposed satellite district turned divine temple, with the intention of smashing it into New Domino, triggering a massive zero reverse event in hopes of stopping future use of energy or synchros. Okay, so first question, if you have the ability to go to the past, why not just tell everyone the danger energy presents if not handled properly? Like, I can understand contrivances for the sake of the plot, and they're clearly going for an evil deeds for the greater good angle here, but what's stopping Aporio from going to the past, like, BT dubs, guys, if you don't get this whole clean energy thing figured out, robots are gonna start copper bombing the place. Deuces. No, the logical conclusion is to cause a Chernobyl-level disaster and hope that teaches everyone a lesson. In fairness, using synchro summons as a metaphor for a potential technological singularity is actually an intriguing way of blending the card game into the narrative, especially since, in the real-world context, this was a drastic change to the game's format that had the potential of breaking it. Nowadays, every new Yu-Gi-Oh series is expected to introduce a unique form of summoning that the story is then built around, Zexals with Xyz, Arc View with Pendulums, etc. But at this point in the franchise, 5D's was treading new ground with this. tuners and synchros were the first clear attempt at redefining the playstyle of the game by adding in a new summoning style not outlined in the earlier rule sets. And with it came a degree of apprehension from longtime players who felt this presented a negative shift in the game's design, as it signaled an escalation in speed. Synchro summons? Cringe! So taking that idea and using it as the driving force for the antagonist's actions was a smart way of placing them in direct opposition to the main protagonists, who now have to prove it's worth protecting. The issue, however, is that by casually introducing time travel into an ongoing story, specifically time travel that characters seemingly have control over, it effectively takes the audience's suspension of disbelief out behind a shed to be put down like a Vendread's player. Because it gives 0-1 and the rest of Iliaster near omnipotent power without an established limit. This is not a narrative that accounted for time travel when it was originally written, so the story has to repeatedly bend over backwards to justify the villains messing with the timeline and how that affects past events. A challenge it handles with the grace of, well, me. Like, Iliaster were actually the ones that caused the original Zero Reverse in an attempt to make sure humanity never use energy again, thus preventing their future, even though it was established in the preceding arcs that it was caused by the Darksigners to open up the gates for the Earthbound Immortals. There's absolutely no reason to retcon this plot point other than to retroactively insert these new villains into the previously established lore at the cost of the story already told. It's the Bleach school of writing.
Hold on. Didn't you say this video was to talk about how amazing 5D's is? Why have you spent the last 15 minutes ragging on it?
Oh, that was the first guy. I'm the replacement, and I'm going for more of a critical re-examination angle here. Definitely didn't get most of the way through this script and realized I had to address certain writing flaws that popped up. Absolutely not. In all honesty, these last two arcs feel like a story where the writer had a strong idea of their ending and then worked backwards. Not necessarily the wrong approach. Plenty of authors write their stories that way since it gives them a clear direction to work towards with their characters. It's just that with 5D's, they had their end goal in mind, but then struggled to get there from where they were. So the holes were filled in with time travel retcons and fleets of robots. I can overlook a decent amount of these slip-ups though, because it all culminates in one of my favorite arcs of this entire franchise. The Ark Cradle arc, as it is back-to-back-to-back bangers. When I said previously that a sizable chunk of the best duels from this series were cut by 4Kids, nearly all of them are in this 24-episode finale. And it's here that all the thematic seeding over the course of the last 60 episodes gets paid off. In order to stop Iliaster's plan to destroy New Domino with a future version of the satellite, Team 5D's are left with no choice but to take the Norse God Express up to the Ark Cradle itself in hopes they can reverse its trajectory, with the knowledge this might be a suicide mission. But before the signers can face off against Zone to save the day, they need to get through his three mini-bosses. First, there's Sherry, whose inability to get over the loss of her parents leads her to believing Zone can create a version of the world where everyone's reconnected with their loved ones, as long as he's allowed to blow up this one teeny tiny city. She almost gets Crow on her side too by taking advantage of his love for the orphans he looks after, until Akiza reminds him that they can't wallow in the past and have to move forward if they want to make the future a better place. Also, Sherry's soul-binding gate is just so sick. Then on the note of insane visual spectacle, there's Yusei's match against Bruno, the robotic form of Antimony, whose mission was to push Yusei into learning a new form of synchro summoning that would help them draw out the Ark Cradle. This plan was complicated, however, by his temporary amnesia, resulting in his alternate personality Bruno becoming attached to Yusei and Team 5D's, and seeing the potential they had to save the future their own way. So, torn between his allegiance to Zone and his friendship with Yusei, Antinomy creates a do-or-die situation. If Yusei can't beat him by surpassing the limits of Excel Synchro, thus proving he can defeat Zone and save the future, he'll be absorbed into a black hole. Additionally, I didn't realize until working on this part of the script and looking up the proper pronunciation, the wordplay going on with Antimony's naming. Clever. But by far my favorite duel of this arc, and the one I want to put a special spotlight on, is Jack, Luna, and Leo's match against Aporia, the combined form of Team New World. Because, as I hinted at earlier about an hour ago, this is where Leo truly gets his moment to shine. You see, throughout the series, Leo is constantly framed as having to live in the shadow of the signers, including his own twin sister. He's the kid that's desperate to prove themselves, but that just makes him look that much more mature. He constantly makes mistakes in his vain attempts to keep up with the rest of the team, resulting in an impressive loss record, and usually requiring others' help to get him out of trouble. Up until they arrive at the Ark Cradle, Leo is the symbol of mediocrity. And the match with Aporio doesn't start much differently. All Leo's strategies to get the upper hand end up completely backfiring, causing Jack and Luna to suffer as each of his attempts to help get countered by the robot from the future. Mistake after mistake brings Jack and Luna closer to death's door, pushing Leo to his absolute limits. So Aporio gives him a choice: take the L and spare his friends from death, or keep fighting in spite of it all. And this is why it's interesting that Leo was made the star of this match. Repeatedly, Leo's seen that he isn't good enough to play on the rest of the team's level, and now that weakness could come at the cost of the lives of his loved ones. This is an impossibly frustrating situation for a child to be put into. But rather than give up, he stakes his life on making sure Luna and Jack can make it through the match alive. And that's what finally awakens his own signer mark, shattering the metaphorical and literal shell of his ace monster into the live-stream dragon teased over 100 episodes ago. I know some feel Crow took Leo's spot as the 5th signer at the end of the Dark Signers, thus ruining his implied character arc that was set up early on, but I feel this whole self-actualization moment here works at its best this late into the game. For all the talk about surpassing one's limits throughout these last 2 arcs, that's a far easier mentality to keep when you already have dozens of wins already at your back, but another thing entirely when you don't. Leo has lost and lost and lost, and while he almost gives up, he finds the courage to push through in the end. That's why of all the signers, Leo is the one who feels like he genuinely earns his mark, rather than something given to him at birth. Yeah, it admittedly sucks that one of the 2 female main characters in this series is ultimately relegated to being nothing more than a tool for a brother's development, but even then, I can't help but love this match. It takes a well-told story to take a C-tier character who's made to be the butt of the joke and turn them around in a single duel. No matter how much I gripe about its shaky build-up, all the duels in the Ark Cradle are full of pathos and drama that makes each antagonist more nuanced than a temporary wall that needs to be worked around by the protagonists. Sherry is racked with grief over her parents that she's willing to believe Zone can bring them back and refuses to hear otherwise. Antimony is torn between loyalties of friends who have diametrically opposed goals. And Aporio is desperate to save humanity from the despair-filled future they had to live through. But it takes one child's personal growth moment to make him realize that there's still hope there if one's ready to fight for it. This entire arc further proves the point that the best duels in this series are often less about the actual game being played and more about the meaning behind them. Which brings us to the final matchup, Yusei versus Zone. And I don't know how well I can articulate this one other than pointing wildly at the 2 flying through the skies new domino as the Ark Cradle comes crashing down around them. This is 5D's over-the-top nature mixed with genuine sincerity, reaching critical overload. As Zone waxes philosophical about the nature of despair and wanting to save mankind from its own hubris by putting the world in its place before it flies too close to the sun, all while smashing Yusei in a building like it's a shonen battle manga. And on top of it all, there's even the recurring tournament MC choosing to stay behind at the sector security building to provide color commentary for the match so that the rest of New Domino can properly flee while still getting the play-by-play. Not only because it will help with evacuations, but because he just loves the game that much. This is the equivalent of an Evo commentator remaining at their table as the venue around them crumbles so that no one misses a single mix-up. And if not to bring it all full circle, Yusei's final play is to use all his friends' signature dragons for one massive limit over excel synchro, tying together the idea of how important bonds are that has been littered throughout this series. This isn't about Yusei summoning a dragon the size of the Seattle Tower. This is a culmination of the bonds he made to get here, helping him to protect the present and save the future. That's because if anything is going to make the world a better place, it's not through more destruction and death. It's not rejecting reality or embracing cynicism. It's the ability to rely on those around you. The connections you make with others are what's going to make the difference in the end and help you to be a better person. Even Zone understood this deep down when he originally started this plan, as he had a faint hope that the true Yusei could be guided to protect the future, as that was the hidden reason he sent a Timony to teach him about Excel Synchro in the first place. And in the end, that was the key to bring the people together to make sure their future doesn't happen. So Zone can find peace leaving the present in their hands. Yes, I know it's corny, shonen, power of friendship shit. Shut up, it's hype. Frankly, when I started my rewatch of 5D's, I wasn't expecting much beyond something to listen to in the background while I worked on other scripts. Definitely wasn't planning on making an hour-long video about it. It had been years since I'd seen the series the entire way through, and never with the sub version proper. So I was mostly just curious to see how it held up, and that's why I was surprised with how genuinely invested I was in these characters by the end. Even if some of them got completely shafted for a large portion of the story. Yusei's hopes to save the satellite after years of strife and poverty, Jack's struggles between his childhood friendships and his desire to be the best, Akiza dealing with her emotional trauma with her parents and coming to accept her psychic powers as part of who she is, and Leo's 140 episode long journey to finally get a W. This is everything Yu-Gi-Oh! As a series does at its best, using card games to prop up fun, engaging character stories. But I think the most interesting point 5D's makes is actually in its epilogue. With the Ark Cradle issue resolved, New Domino is now safe, and all the steps have been taken to make sure that bleak future won't happen, leaving Team 5D's with a question. What now? After fighting so hard to guarantee their future, what are they gonna do with it? These characters have relied so much on each other to make it through the last couple world-ending catastrophes that they're uncertain of where they go from here. Each of them is presented with options on what they can do moving forward, but all of them require them moving away from the others. After finally talking about it, Jack is the only one prepared to break up the group if that's what it requires for him to pursue his goal. And while it sounds selfish at first, it's also understanding of the issue. Their work as signers is done. It's time that they go out and live their own lives now. Everyone's still apprehensive though, so Yusei proposes one last match with Jack, under the pretense it will help him make his own decision. But it's more than that. A frequent theme across Yu-Gi-Oh! And shonen anime in general is the importance of friendship. How if you have friends by your side, they'll get you through anything. And that's a great lesson to reinforce. It's a staple of the genre for a reason. But the note 5D's ends on is a bit more mature than that. While those bonds are important for getting you through life, there will come times where you have to stand on your own 2 feet and walk your own path, possibly away from those friends, which is never easy. Whether it's moving to a new town for university or relocating for your job, saying goodbye to your friends can be tough. So in the same vein of Yugi vs. Atem and Duel Monsters, this epilogue duel is a way for the characters to put a close to this chapter in their life. This story started with Yusei looking to settle his feud with Jack after what happened between them in the satellite, and it concludes with the two saying goodbye to each other and their friends in the only way they know how. Plus, if there was a duel to send this series off on, it's this. An even back and forth match between characters with an extensive history, a showcase of how synchro summons fundamentally change the way duels are approached, hype motorcycle action, all made better through the use of fantastic insert songs. And in the end, Yusei pulls through by utilizing all the same low-level junk cards he's been playing since the first episodes, keeping to his core ideology that every card and person has its purpose to the very end. Everyone has their place in life, and it's just a matter of going out to discover what that is. 5D's may be known as a darker series within the grander Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise, but in actuality, it's brimming with hope that we can all find our way eventually, even if we struggle along the way. It's simply having the confidence in yourself and the bonds you make getting there. Thanks again for watching, and have a good one. Anyway, thanks everyone for being so patient with me on this one. Real talk, I've been struggling with massive burnout the last few months and figuring out what I want this channel to be going forward, so I deeply appreciate that many of you are more than willing to let me take my time to finish these videos. And a special shout out to my patrons who support me over on Patreon. If you want to help support the channel like these lovely people on screen, that would make me do a big smile. And with all that said, I'm gonna go back to playing Master Duel.